We're going to get started with our luncheon speaker, and I've got the pleasure of introducing to you Bryan McKinley Jones Brayboy, who is an associate professor of educational leadership and policy studies at Arizona State University and a really great friend. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. His areas of specialization are anthropology of education, the sociology of education, higher education, and American Indian education. He teaches critical race theory and other courses related to diversity in education at Arizona State University, and he co-directs the Center on Indian Education at ASU. I can't tell you what a wonderful colleague and mentor and leader that he is, and I am so pleased to be able to bring him to you today. Let's welcome Bryan.
Oh, I think it's fine.
Good morning, good afternoon. Feels like morning to me, but I guess it's afternoon. My name is Bryan McKinley Jones Brayboy. I'm the son of Mary Elizabeth Jones Brayboy. She was the daughter of Zelma Sampson Jones and Rosebell McMillan Jones. She's also the daughter of McKinley Jones Sr. Also the son of Bobby Dean Brayboy. He's the son of Eva Harris Brayboy, and he comes to Bryan Brayboy II. Named after my two grandfathers. My parents had this deal where if they had girls, my mom got to name them. If they had boys, my father got to name them, and they had three boys. So there was no justice in the world where that was concerned. Let me just first acknowledge the fact that we're on, as I understand it, Apanal Autumn and Peapash lands, and I recognize my role as a visitor here. So I'm going to put myself on the clock, and let's go ahead and get into this. I've changed my title slightly to try to think about equity and equality rather than, and really use sovereignty as a tool to try to get at those two things for you. So if 100 American Indians start 9th grade, of those 100, about 60 will graduate from high school, which is about the national average. Of those 60, 20 will go to some form of post-secondary education, and of those 21, maybe 2 will graduate with a 4-year degree. It takes 2,500 American Indian, Alaska Native 9th graders to produce one master's degree, and about 15,000 American Indian, Alaska Natives to produce one doctoral degree. So it's from these levels of progression to a formal education that I've really begun to build my career. But there's more to this story. More recently, and even sooner, in the next month or so, they're going to release 2009, the National Indian Education Study, which is a two-part study that focuses on the National Assessment of Education Progress. And if you just look, the second from the right chart is what is interesting here for grade 4 for the average scores for NAEP grading. Look at what happens with American Indian and Alaska Natives between 2003 and 2007. There's an uptick, and then we go down. If you go to the next slide, it looks at 8th grade reading for NAEP. Something similar happens. There's a bit of an uptick from 05 to 07, and then it goes, from 03 to 05, and then it drops back down to in 07. There's a bit more in the 4th grade NAEP scores for mathematics. There seems to be a steady increase for grade 4, but in grade 8 we have something similar happening where there's a fall in scores. So if you look at that, it's a pretty level, all 4 of those slides are pretty level in terms of what's happening with those. And so because of scores like this, and because of the state of American Indian achievement levels, I'm becoming increasingly concerned. In fact, there's a crisis in Indian country among our American Indian and Alaska Native children, and I've come to believe that we need both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. So many people are beginning to address early childhood education and elementary education. Part of what I've done for the last dozen years or so is begin to prepare American Indian teachers and leaders really to try to figure out that top-down piece. So focusing on licensing good teachers who understand their children, the places where they teach, really allows us to begin to address it from this top-down model and continue to support the bottom-up support as well. So it's from that place that I want to really begin this conversation and talk about Indigenous peoples as liminal beings. And liminal in some ways is really about sort of a twist in between or sort of a both thing. So we're both a racialized group as well as a political legal group. And so part of what I want to do in the remainder of this talk is begin to outline what I mean by this legal status. By looking at things like executive orders, Supreme Court findings, legislative acts, and so on, about 5,000 different government actions and documents. But also begin to outline how this interfaces with the three main characters of the story I'm going to tell you. The University of Utah, Mountain States Legal Foundation, and the American Indian Teacher Training Program, which I founded in 2002. And really think about the disconnect between what happens when groups frame Indigenous people solely as racialized beings versus the ways in which you begin to engage as both racialized beings but also legal political ones. And that's the liminal status that I'm really talking about. And I really want to point to the ways that this conversation is relevant for sovereignty. And so here's my point. Sovereignty matters. And the way that we begin to get at this is by examining issues of sovereignty. So before jumping into the rest of this conversation, I think it's worth talking about the connections and disconnections between equality and equity. There's an awful lot of conversations out there that often conflate the two of these things, and I think that that's troubling and problematic as we work through this. Equality is really about sameness. And this is the ideal on which this country, in many ways, is founded. It's about individual sameness and everyone having the same opportunities, whereas equity is about fairness, from my perspective, and about justice. And more specifically, it's about ensuring that individuals and groups receive what they need in order to be able to make choices. And so sometimes fairness or equity is actually unequal. And that's really the rub, and that's part of what's happening in the story that I'm going to begin to talk about, which is what happens when notions of equality bump up against notions of equity. And much of this is rooted in what Lumbee scholar David Wilkins calls the 4 T's. Tribal sovereignty, treaties, trust, and territory. These legal and political concepts are really what make Indigenous peoples both racialized groups, but also legal and political ones as well. And this is a really important foundational component for this conversation I want to have with you for the next few minutes. Tribal sovereignty is largely rooted in the notion that native nations have some control over their own ways of engaging in the world and the right to be independent in the ways in which they engage the world. And Shinigolamo and Teresa McCarty argue that it's the right of people to self-government, self-determination, and self-education. Sovereignty is taken on many forms. It's been talked about as a political and legal stance, as a cultural stance, as one of a rhetorical stance. So that Scott Lyons, who's a rhetorician and composition person, is now writing about rhetorical sovereignty. Treaties are these documents that are signed between two sovereign nations. And according to the Supreme Court, they are and continue to be the supreme law of the land. But it's important that treaties got signed between two equal, independent, sovereign entities, and it literally takes an act of Congress to get rid of treaties. Trust, and I'm running through this. I teach a class on this stuff, so I'm doing it in 3 minutes, but we should really be doing it over the next 16 weeks. Trust takes many forms, but really it's about this relationship between Indigenous tribal nations and the U.S. government. And tribal sovereigns, through trust, at least in theory, are entitled to those things that are not explicitly taken away in treaties. Many people are under the assumption that treaties grant rights to people, but that's not exactly right where Indigenous peoples are concerned. What treaties do is really take away rights, and then what's left is really the idea that Indigenous peoples maintain those rights and aren't really removed. And then finally, this notion of territory. important for me to acknowledge the Yakimawa and Pequot peoples, is land. And it's that land that really roots groups of people in terms of their cultural ways of being, but also in terms of notions of spirituality. So when I'm talking about these four concepts separately, it's important to recognize from my perspective and from the scholars that I draw on perspective, that you really can't have one without the other. It's the treaties that allow trust to emerge, it's the tribal sovereignty that allow the treaties to go, and without territory or lands, this is really a difficult conversation for us to have. So I just want to make sure that as I move forward with this, that we understand that these four T's really do go together. We can't have three T's or two or even one, really. So over the course of signing 371 treaties between the U.S. government and tribal nations, Indigenous people ceded 1 billion acres of land. That's with a B. And a part of this, there were three promises largely contained in these treaties between the federal government and tribal nations. One was around health, provided health care services. One was around education, and there's boilerplate language in about 103 of these treaties that say, here's the education that's going to happen. And the last is really the general welfare of tribal peoples. It's hard to pull these things apart. I know that you are having these conversations about connections between education and health and the overall welfare of peoples, and that's really a conversation I think we need to continue to have. But part of what I want to focus on today is really what happens when someone has the power and the ability to define a group of people as either racialized, as only racialized, versus us wanting to, my program wanting to define us as both racialized and legal and political beings. So today I really want to talk about this liminality. Again, that's the racialized component and the legal political components for Indigenous peoples. So this unique status really means that education for Indigenous peoples has developed differently than it has for education for many other members of society in at least three fundamental ways. And it really is rooted in this political obligation of this relationship around the four T's that I've talked about. And for me, equity is about this justice, and it's caught up in treaties and trust. It's really about the equitable component and treatment of Indigenous peoples and their group rights as opposed to individual rights that often get framed through equality. So particularly on the reservations, American Indian education has developed in three fundamentally different ways. Although I can imagine that many of you all here will say, this is what we've become. So it's not just about Indigenous peoples either. But the federal government was directly involved in the creation of American Indian education. And what drove that conversation is around the problematic goal of assimilation. The idea was to take these savage heathens, put them into school, cut their hair, clean them up, and begin to make them more white-like, as it were. So in large part, this is again rooted in the treaty and trust responsibilities and this desire to use that to civilize these savages. And because the federal government was involved in this, it really leads to the second point that I think is important, which is Indian education is centralized within the federal government. In fact, Title VII of No Child Left Behind focuses on American Indian and Alaska Native education. We have our own title within the law itself. Here's the other piece that's important for this, which is that for Indigenous peoples, the government then sets policies about how to address the needs of Indigenous peoples. And over the last 100 years, there have been 5 different policy changes. Roughly every 20 or 25 years, the government says, we want to do this a bit differently. So what that means is it makes it difficult for Indigenous peoples to engage in self-determination, to say, here are the ways that we want to educate ourselves and move towards education, because really what happens is the land gets, the course of the land gets changed over time. And as I said, these policy changes limit self-determination when it comes from the federal government. And finally, American Indian public education is financed really through the federal government as opposed to local taxes. So for many of you all who are running schools, Johnson O'Malley funds, for example, come from the federal government. And that's really ideally what's supposed to happen with those monies is they're supposed to be pulled off of resources, natural resources, and other endeavors that exist on reservations. That's not really often what happens. So But those are really the three ways that it differs. Starting with the federal government towards assimilation, it is comes from the federal government in terms of the policies that get set up, and then finally it's financed through the federal government. So ultimately, this desire of tribal communities to control how our children are educated, by whom and to what ends, rests on the whims of the federal government. And for all of these reasons, American Indian education is unique in its relationship to federal government. So perhaps, again, I'm referencing Creek scholar Shanina Lomo-Lame. Her point really hits this home when she says that the history of American Indian education can really best be described by three simple words: battle for power. We can't have conversations about equality or equity without really fully engaging these notions of power. And power really is a mechanism of control to define who counts, whose voice matters, and so on. So I'm going to talk a bit about this clash around power, and really this battle for Indigenous peoples to be framed as both racialized groups, but also importantly as political and legal ones as well. And even though this point has been made repeatedly, the numbers are closing in on 6,000 in terms of legislative acts, executive orders, and things coming from the government. This continues to be one of these things that many of us don't recognize, this notion of sovereignty. And what does it mean to have a trusted relationship with Indigenous peoples? So let me just say the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about these questions and really hope to move beyond a simplified notion of equal access and racial diversity. What's happening is that the right and those who really don't want to engage in issues of equity have taken up the rights of taken up the language of the civil rights movement and used it for their own ends to begin to say, we're not going to do this because it's unequal. And so here are these questions. How does federal policy towards American Indian education meet the on-the-ground practice of educational institutions, legal challenges in American Indian communities, and what does this mean for institutions of higher education? And I'm also going to say, what does it mean for K through 12 institutions? And really these questions are rooted in these testimonies of people. I lived this a few years ago, so in some ways I'm going to tell you a bit of a story. And I should say that there are two unlikely allies in this. There is the institution where I worked for a number of years who continues to claim that it is all for Indigenous rights, and a very conservative legal foundation called the Mountain States Legal Foundation, who really wants to control the nature of the discourse at this institution, and in fact really control the nature of the discourse in larger society. So at the minimum, what becomes clear is that the institution walks away from its responsibility to this program. So without getting too much into the rest of this, let's get to the good stuff or these data that I've pulled. I'm going to start at the beginning, I'm going to pull back, I'm going to sort of walk us through the story, and it's not a linear story, it's a circular story. So on Wednesday, February 11th, I was in the middle of an institutional review board meeting when my BlackBerry, which is what I was carrying at the time, started buzzing like crazy. And it buzzed essentially for the last 90 minutes of this meeting. And it wasn't until after the meeting that I learned that this conservative legal foundation had issued a challenge through a press release to this program that I founded in 2002, largely stating that our program was illegal and violated the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And one of the important pieces of this is near the bottom in that slide that's bolded, which is that that the program that we started, the American Indian Teacher Training Program, uses race or ethnicity as a prerequisite for eligibility for the program. So there were, besides phone calls from senior leadership at the institution to me, saying to me, not even asking, ordering me to call them right away. There were emails from the 3 local papers. We have 2 local papers and the student newspapers from reporters asking for me to comment on this. One of them was kind enough to send me an attachment of the full press release. So as I walked back to my office, sort of trudging slowly back to the office, I got a real sense, both at that point and then in the following hours and days and weeks, that in fact my university wasn't really prepared to deal with this civil rights issue. They were inadequately prepared. to do it. And in some ways, it's because Mountain State's legal foundation frames the conversation as something that requires race as a prerequisite. But in fact, we had another side of the story, which is to say it's about self-determination, it's about sovereignty, it's about our trust relationship. And I want to just say to you, so there's this press release that you just saw that's up here that says, this is an illegal program. And I want to read to you from one of the students in the program, and this is from our final assignment in the course that I taught called Indigenous Epistemologies for these undergraduate students. It's really sort of how Indigenous peoples come to know and engage in the world. So forgive me while I read this to you, but it's a beautiful piece of writing. So she says, I grew up on a reservation. When I was 5, my parents decided that I should go to the boarding school for Indians because they thought I could get a good education there. It was like a military school where the teachers were strict and hit us if we spoke our tribal language. I hated it there, but I kept going because I thought education would make a difference. I didn't want the white people in town to call me a dirty, stinking Indian or to think that they were better than me. I guess I didn't realize that the teachers would also call me a dirty, dumb Indian. And the education I got was bad anyway, and the white people still told me I was dirty and that I stunk. That school, being the boarding school, could have helped me understand what I know today. My language is a good language. And I should know I can be smart and Indian at the same time, and I'm not dirty, stinky, or dumb. I can do what I want. I think those white teachers thought they were doing us a favor by telling us we should just learn English, and that learning the white people's ways were best. If they only understood how good our ways were, too, and understood who we were, school may have been better. Instead, it was hell. I want to be a teacher so that my students can see that being smart and Indian go hand in hand. Just because I'm Indian doesn't mean I can't be smart, and it doesn't mean they can't learn. Knowing what their lives is like and understanding what it means to be Indian means I can be a better teacher for them. I know that we need to educate our own and prepare them for places like this university, white society, and our reservation. Only we can do that work, and we learn anyway that it's our right to educate ourselves. White people just don't understand that, and they think they're so smart. So I should say about this teacher, I would interview these students entering into our program, and one of the first questions I would ask is, why do you want to be a teacher? And this person became a leader in our program, and still in some ways really pushes me to think around the ways that I engage the world. And she had a pretty simple reason for wanting to be a teacher. She said, I hated school. I want to be a teacher because I hate school and I want to change it. So in the state of Utah, at the time when I was writing these grants, there were essentially, out of every 1,000 teachers who were working with American Indian kids, there were 2 who were American Indians who were certified to work with them. There was an enormous need to begin to prepare Indigenous teachers working with these children in our state. And I wrote this grant in part as a response to conversations that I was having with tribal leaders around what is it that they want in terms of educating their populations, and how can the universities and educational institution and someone who can recommend students for licensure to the state, how might we come in and use our expertise to serve their needs? So this project was really written by, for, and with Indigenous peoples in mind, and 7 tribal nations in the state of Utah all had a hand in this. It was really about meeting the needs of their children, and ideally about a move towards those Indigenous communities to be able to say, here's how we're going to define the future for our children. So this is an important point as we begin to think about equity and sovereignty and the important work that you all are doing here, which is we have to learn how to listen. And I continue to struggle with this, but I think at least for those of us in higher education, we often go into communities and say, we know what's wrong with you and we're going to help you fix it. Rather than going in and saying, we've got this expertise, you have a wonderful knowledge of your communities, how might we begin to serve you? And frankly, I think this is true for K-12 schools, with the BIE schools, Bureau of Indian Education schools that I work with. We have to do a better job across the board of going in and saying, tell me what you need, and really stopping and listening in terms of the expertise that people have in their own lives. So, in their own communities. So this program is really rooted in this notion of self-determination in education, really coming out of this trust responsibility that I talked about earlier. And on April 30th, 2004, President George W. Bush signs an executive order into law, 13336. And in part, there's a long executive order, it's 5 pages long, and part of what he says in this, and I'm quoting from this, is that the United States has a unique legal relationship with Indian tribes and special relationship with Alaskan Indian entities, as provided in the Constitution of the United States, treaties, and federal statutes. He goes on to say we want to work with these federally recognized tribal governments on a government-to-government basis, and continues to say we want to value language and culture in assisting these indigenous children in meeting the demanding needs of No Child Left Behind. So this executive order goes on to outline programs like this program that I'm talking about today to say, here's one way that we might begin to do this. But interestingly, in its challenge to us, Mountain States Legal Foundation, and by the way, this replaced the 1998 executive order that President Clinton had signed, which was actually much stronger. Won't surprise anyone. It was much stronger than what the Bush administration had signed into law. But when Mountain States Legal Foundation looks at this, it begins to challenge our program as they did on February 11, 2004, a month and a half before this executive order comes out. They largely ignore this language around framing indigenous peoples as legal and political entities, and instead reframe the program as something that's violating the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment. And so I really want to begin to go back and look and see what exactly Mountain States Legal is about and why they're challenging our program. So according to their website, and it's mountainstateslegal.org in case you're interested, their mission is to, and I'm quoting here, seek the proper application of the Constitution and interpretation of the law in the courts, administrative agencies, and other forms, and in doing so, I quote here, they champion the rights and liberties guaranteed by the Constitution in support of individual and business enterprises and against unwarranted government intrusion. This is going to become really important because the focus of their work is on the individual. And as we begin to think about notions like equality or equity, equality really is rooted in individual components and a meritocratic belief around society that focuses on an individual who just works hard enough. They go on to say, and by the way, this group is no joke. They've argued in front of the Supreme Court 9 times. They've won a number of those cases, really fighting against programs like this and land ownership by indigenous peoples. And they go on to say, we're going to represent people pro bono, that is for free, if they want to bring a case for this, and that they really want to ensure that the law is applied in its proper fashion and to change public attitudes regarding important matters of public policy. And in part, that's what this press release ends up attempting to do. So there's a clash here. Mountain States Legal Foundation says it's about equality and about individual rights. Our program says it's about self-determination through self-education and the group rights and the trust responsibilities between the federal government and indigenous nations. And this resulting trust relationship really highlights the fact that equity matters too. It's not just sovereignty, but equity and justice matter as well in trying to engage differences or educational achievement and others among indigenous peoples. So this latter argument that Mountain States Legal Foundation makes around individuality mattering really refocuses the conversation around race and reframing our program as one that's race-based. And in fact, they argue that this will, in their words, invoke the strict scrutiny test. And in fact, the University of Utah will lose this case if in fact it comes forward. So by suggesting that no compelling interest exists, the Mountain States Legal Foundation explains with respect to the racial preference that any Utah student who happens to apply to this will absolutely win its case. And here they go on to say it's a sure thing as you can get in federal court today, and that we have no basis for refusing people to open the door for all of this, for these people to enter. And then they go on to invoke programs like Princeton and MIT who have abandoned similar race-based programs. So in the wake of the Michigan case, the 2003 Supreme Court cases, universities began to abandon quote-unquote, race-based programs. Just a quick side note for this. In Indian country, particularly in remote parts of Indian country, teachers, non-native teachers who aren't from those communities, who go in and teach children there, tend to last on average 7 months in their job before they leave. And it's not uncommon for children in these communities to have 3 or 4 teachers over the course of the year, whereas native teachers from those communities stay for 5 years. There's a huge difference in terms of what happens with teachers who are from that place, who go back to that place to teach those children from the place that they're from. So at the core of their argument, Mountain States Legal utilizes the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment to make their components. Here's the problem, though. These arguments put forth are out of place, since they fail to recognize the legal and political status of American Indians in couching their arguments in this anti-affirmative action. They choose to buttress and anchor their argument by referencing the Constitution and the Civil Rights Act without acknowledging the Constitution in the ways in which it recognizes Indigenous peoples as legal and political beings. But it's also important the fact that they really want to frame this around a black-white binary, which we have to move away from in this case, and by framing this as an equal access case. So equal access is really about this notion of equality. And when we think about Native Indigenous peoples in this country, we have to move away from framing the conversations that way to think about the importance of the group status and individuals within those particular groups. So the press release goes on to state that the only way to rectify this program is to open up the program to all students who are quote-unquote qualified. And it seems that in offering this, it seems awfully fair, doesn't it, to say, just let anyone who wants to teach these poor children, let's get them prepared to go out and teach them. But in some ways what they're doing is they're calling on age-old policies around assimilation and white supremacy, and they're arguing from what Pierre Bourdieu and Pascal called Genesis amnesia. That is, they seem to have forgotten the beginning. They seem to have forgotten the beginning. And really what I want to do here is pull on the work of a legal scholar here at ASU named Rebecca Sosi, an Indigenous legal scholar, who begins to say, wait a second, let's go back and look at the beginning and really look at some of the first treaties signed between the U.S. government and the Lenape Nation, or otherwise known as the Delaware Nation. So let me just quote to you what she says from this article. After all, everyone knows that tribes are not really sovereign, right? And haven't they always been subject to these doctrines? The answer, quite simply, is no. She continues by writing, we've been socialized and conditioned to accept this statute as the reality of things, but it is not. How many of us remember a time before European people arrived? And then she goes on to talk about the oral histories and the writings of peoples. How many of us remember the time that Europeans came crawling to tribal elders for their support and protection against enemy groups, both native and non-native? The first treaties between the U.S. and the native nations tell that story, such as the 1778 Treaty of Fort Pitt with the Delaware Nation, in which U.S. officials begged the Delaware nations to have, quote, safe passage through, quote, their country, and also begged for military assistance from the Delaware and Lenape against the evil king of England. Who were the Americans, Sosi writes, at the time? Did they think they had the right to claim title to native land? No. Did they think they had the right to disinter native remains and cart them off to museums and laboratories? No. Did they think they had the right to unilaterally command the Delawares to obey their laws? No, no, and no. End quote. And it's not just at the beginning that Mountain States Legal Foundation seems to have missed the boat on this. It's also during the present day. So one of the critical pieces missing from this press release is the idea that there's an entire legal code that focuses on American Indians, just as there's an entire legal code that focuses on the education of American Indians. And there's a 1974 Supreme Court case, McCurry v. Morton, which is still true, although given the way the Supreme Court has engaged more recently, we're not sure if they're going to continue to take up precedent or not. But in the Morton case, the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, gets sued for its preference for hiring indigenous peoples. And the Supreme Court writes in this case that in fact American Indians and this preference does not constitute, and I'm quoting from the brief, does not constitute racial discrimination. Indeed, it is not even racial preference. They go on to say that the preference is not directed towards a racial group consisting of Indians. Instead, it applies only to members of federally recognized tribes. In this sense, the preference is political rather than racial in nature. And here opens the door to group rights and refocuses the conversation from the individual rights of everyone to be able to compete for the same job. So in their efforts to champion individual rights, Mountain States Legal appears not to consider what happens when individual rights clash with group rights. In fact, they're arguing that their idea of the proper interpretation of the Constitution privileges individual rights over the United States commitments to indigenous peoples. And so it's this idea when we begin to think about indigenous peoples solely as racialized beings that's at the heart of assimilation and the conflict which this presentation hinges. In short, group rights matter. They matter a lot, at least where Makari is concerned and where the recent executive orders are concerned. And this clash of the importance of individual rights versus group rights highlights the clash between equality and equity. Because equality, which is, again, based on individual rights, maintains the status quo, while equity, which often gets framed around group rights and concerns, seeks to address change and move towards recognizing history and moving towards this elusive idea of equality. So my argument here is that you have to have equity first before we can actually move to this thing called equality. So in many ways, what Mountain States Legal Foundation does is take up this notion that legal professor Felix Cohen wrote about in 1935 called transcendental nonsense. And about transcendental nonsense, part of what Cohen writes, he says about these legal findings and these scholars, that they utilize legal language, and I'm quoting here, in a manner that one finds the thought of courts and legal scholars trapezing around in cycles and epicycles without coming to rest on the floor of verifiable fact. Later, part of what he would say is that by taking up this language that has no basis in fact, gets used to say these things aren't reasonable, to make things that are in fact unreasonable reasonable. And here's the rub and the concern for me, because what they do by taking up transcendental nonsense, they obfuscate the fact that indigenous peoples have this legal relationship with the federal government that really enables these peoples to say, we want to educate our own. And in fact, by doing that, they make this seem reasonable, when in fact it's quite unreasonable. And given, frankly, I get emails from them almost every quarter telling me what a bad person I am. They continue to follow me around. I've actually grown to respect this group because they at least they have a pretty clear message, a consistent message about what it is they want to do. I was a bit more concerned about my own institution, however, that was supposed to be protecting our program, so that the day that this press release gets issued, I left my meeting, I walked back to my office, I made phone calls, called the vice president to whom I reported, and she said, get your things together, we're going to have a conference call. So I went back to my office, and what I wanted to do was curl up under my desk in a fetal position and just cry. Instead, I went to my filing cabinet and put out manila folders around the legal basis for what we were trying to do. Shortly after I got situated, the university operator calls me. I joined a conference call that has our provost, the vice president for diversity, our general counsel, one of his people, and then the head of public relations. And during the conversation, the legal counsel says to me, what cases do you have that I can begin to get to? So I'm providing legal citations. I'm giving them the name of the Office of General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Education. And once he was satisfied with that, he hung up, and I continued on, and as did the provost. I continued on with one of the general counsel members and the head of public relations. And I voiced some displeasure about this, essentially saying they don't seem to understand the law, at which point the public relations person said to me, don't talk to the press that way. And I said to her, I've spoken to the press, I understand that I probably shouldn't do this in public, but I'm frustrated about this. the legal counsel stayed quiet, and the public relations officer said, the last thing we want to do is add any more fire, add any more fuel to this fire. So at the time, I was concerned about the fact that the university had moved pretty quickly to damage control by saying, oops, we better try to run away from this. But I was also distressed by the fact that no one on this conversation expressed any concern for its students, staff, or faculty who were engaged in this program. And in many ways, it felt to me like the institution was engaging in and perpetuating this Genesis amnesia. And they began to build a strategy around just denying this and pushing it back to the federal government. So at this point, I'm sending on my email, I'm sending my notes around trust responsibility and the legal citations to both the Office of General Counsel and the Public Relations Officer, and suggesting that she take these up and do what educational institutions do, which is to educate the public. And say, here's a moment for us. And I assumed legal counsel would be very happy about doing this kind of thing, but we all know what happens when we assume. And so I got beaten back on this, but I remember walking out the door after this conference and thinking, how is it that I, as a non-tenured assistant professor of education, was in a position where I was giving legal advice to our general counsel about how to address a challenge to one of the university's programs? And why wasn't the general counsel prepared to do this on their own? So caught up in this apathy was really a misunderstanding about the importance of this program and the fact that it wasn't just a race-based program, that it was in fact a legal and political program. I continued to press the issue, and finally he says to me on the phone, Bryan, if they file this lawsuit, it's going to cost us $1 million to fight it. And in my naive assistant professor ways, I said back to him, well then I guess we'll just have to fight it. That didn't go over so well, so they finally backed me into a corner, but it points to the fact that it was really about the material security of the institution that they were most concerned, and not concerned about doing this thing that, for me, seemed like the just thing, the equitable thing to do. And by the way, 2 months before this happened, we were invited to our program had been invited to the president of the university's house for a party that he put on for us. So there are times when our program was safe. In this case, we ended up being quite dangerous, as it turns out. So, okay, I've got 5 minutes. So it was clear to me that there was this idea that the institution was trying to say, we're not going to do this. They backed me into a corner and they said, just don't talk to the press. So I said, okay, I won't talk to the press. Actually, I had a nice reprieve by turning my phone off that night. And when I woke the next morning, the university's public relations officer ended up reinforcing some of the lingering doubts I had about this program. Part of what she was quoted as saying in the newspaper is, it's a federal program. It's not ours. Legal counsel had no comment at all, but this institution's denial, fear, and failure to address this issue head-on really revealed this lack of understanding about legal precedent and really this notion of let's do what's right and just. The institution had a chance to come out fighting on this one and to do the equitable part of this, and when they had a chance to do that and stand up, they shrunk away from this challenge. And I want to add that all of this comes from an institution whose mascot, scratch that, their symbol, they tell me, their symbol is an American Indian, the Ute. And they draw millions of dollars of revenue every year off of a Ute drum and feather on all of their gear. So technically, this public relations officer is right. It is a federal program, it's not theirs. But we had a chance here to engage in educating around justice and educating around trying to help the public understand the importance of sovereignty, and we missed it. And so in her attempt to pour cold water on this fire rather than the fuel that she asked me not to do, she missed her chance. Many of us know that you can actually fight fire with fire. And in this case, we could have done what we were supposed to do in terms of educating the public about this. Part of what we do as educational institutions is educate others. And in this instance, we really failed. So clearly, for Indigenous peoples, there's a life of liminality. In some ways, we're not here or there. We're racialized sometimes, we're legal, political, other ways. In the next 3 months that I was really battling with Mountain States legal around this, I should add only one institutional official asked about the well-being of our students and the staff that was part of it. No one ever asked how I was doing, but I just sort of had to keep going. So again, part of this is the legality of the issue here. The fact that this is based on a government-to-government relationship gets completely erased from the table to focus on the racial implications of this. So, why does this matter for K through 12? And I've been talking about trying to frame this around a top-down and a bottom-up approach. Here's my suggestion. It says that for those of you all who are in schools, you need to push those of us who prepare leaders and educators to do better, to engage in these conversations around equity and equality, to fully pull out this notion that actually treating everyone the same may not in fact be the best way to meet the needs of children, but to focus on the ideas that we have to address the needs of not just individuals but their groups. It's one way to do it. And I think it's imperative that schools and districts open up spaces of possibilities for groups of students to be successful. What happens when we don't do that is we go back to the scores that I started with, which is we're going to continue to remain at or near the bottom with no real signs of improvement over the years. I'm on the technical review panel for the National Indian Education Study. I've seen 2009, and what I can tell you is the story gets worse, not better for American Indian and Alaska Native kids. So among the actors in this story, I think it's important that, and it's true for many of us, we don't have a sense of sovereignty and self-determination in the 4 T's that I started with, and no sense of the liminality for Indigenous peoples. And so really running away, and in this case not adding fuel to the fire, we bear the issue of sovereignty and self-determination for a group of people that it claims to serve the institution really misses the boat. There are consequences for this, and by calling to open up these programs for people with these benefits, opening it up to everyone, really helps to maintain this lack of licensed and certified teachers that serve the needs of Indigenous children. But there's a threat here, and this is what keeps me awake at night. And in fact, Mountain States Legal, Pacific Legal Foundation, or one of these right-leaning conservative legal foundations may actually get someone to bring suit against us. And if they do, what happens? Whose notion of the proper interpretation of the Constitution matters? And in critiquing actually these justices, returning to Felix Cohen in terms of this transcendental nonsense, part of what he turns to in the absurdity of the idea that people can actually say, foundations can actually say, you can't do that even though the law says you can, is that you can actually make reasonable arguments to say, yes, we can. So Cohen actually pulls into this Lewis Carroll's classic book, Through the Looking Glass, to illustrate how these legal decisions and opinions might be used. And I'm going to quote from his footnote. It may be the only time a legal scholar's ever quoted Lewis Carroll. I can't believe that, said Alice. Can't you? Said the Queen in a pitying tone. Try again. Draw a long breath and shut your eyes. Alice laughed. There's no use trying, she said. One can't believe impossible things. I dare say you haven't had much practice, said the Queen. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Sometimes I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. So in calling this program a race-based program, rather than recognizing it as a legal and political instantiation of the law and the rights and around justice, Mountain States Legal urges the university, and in fact the larger public, to believe in impossible things. And yet Cohen warned us that the impossible can in fact not only be believed, but can be engaged in. So again, I'm left wondering, whose Constitution matters? Which citing Indigenous people in the Constitution itself matters? What happens when individual rights and group rights begin to bump up against one another? And it points to the need to examine and explore what we mean by equity and equality. Equality maintains the status quo. And it maintains this idea of transcendental nonsense that in fact everything's just fine. When in fact what we know is that it's not. And if we're going to engage in conversations of equity in our K-12 settings, we must explore the ways that we're meeting the needs of our populations and engage in this historical work of finishing and finding ways to move towards a future where fairness and equal opportunity really exist. They're not just in our imagination. And if we engage in equality, we're really just perpetuating transcendental nonsense and imagining an equal world. And I want to suggest that we move, act, and do equity as quickly and with as much vigor as possible. So let me just finish by saying, because lots of people want to know what happened to the program and what happened to our students. We graduated 43 of the 46 students that we started with. We had $7 million in funding. Most of those people are continuing to work with their Native students and in their communities, and in those cases, in many places, we see their scores actually going up in these pockets where they've traditionally been down. And after these $7 million in graduating more American Indian teachers in a 5-year period than the School of Education had in its previous 75 years, the University of Utah decided to end the program. In fact, they sent $2 million that I had written before I left the institution back to the federal government. But there's some good news here. We established a similar program in Alaska. There are 27 teachers in Alaska Native teachers who are doing their work. We have another 20 pre-service teachers here at ASU who are beginning to do this through similar funding. And I think I want to end by saying that self-determination through education is not a fad. It's a dream, it's a belief, it's an ideology that we're showing can reside within and outside of Utah. So I really appreciate you all having me.